So first off, just a quick disclaimer that this whole video series is going to assume some level of knowledge inside Blender. So um, you're going to want to do some basic tutorials to learn the basic functionalities and getting around the interface and um, manipulating models going in and out of edit mode, object mode, sculpt mode. Um, so just a forewarning that this is not going to go over every little step and how we use every little tool. Um, but so yeah, just it's a good idea to have a general understanding of the tool you're going to be using. Say build a donut, build a coffee cup, do something simple. Doesn't have to be track related. Just build something simple, and it'll help you out in the long run to be able to possibly start making a track. So I've been tossing around the idea lately of doing a video series to take a track from aerial LiDAR into Blender, and then to kind of document the steps of the key steps of most aspects of building a track. Um, Mainly in Assetto Corsa because that's what I'm experienced with. I am in the older version of Blender 2.79. Obviously 2.8 is the way going forward. I just haven't switched over to it yet. A couple tools that I use that are older have not or will not be migrated over, and I just haven't really started a new project that I wanted to jump ship and go over there. But anyway, 2.8 should be fine doing this as well. Most of the concepts apply. And you also find in some of the, as we go forward, some things 2.8 is actually sort of required in one step due to a bug in 2.79. But as I say, the basic principles apply, and at least in the first couple of videos, I'm not using any special tools that are any different. Buttons and settings might be a little different, but overall should be pretty much the same. So the track that we're going to do, data just became available, is North Wilkesboro. It's an oval track in North Carolina. It's a defunct oval track that hasn't been used since from any big series since the mid 90s, um, and was resurrected a little bit for local series in the early mid 2000s, but currently is now deteriorating into Never Never Land. So I've wanted to do it to kind of keep it alive to a degree. There's some oval racing activity in Assetto Corsa, and it's a small little track. Should be a quick little project to cover most aspect of track building. I will do a couple things, show a couple things along the process that pertain mainly to road courses. So I'll try to cover just about every aspect, but just mainly pretty much documenting the build of this small little oval. And so we're going to start off in Cloud Compare. We're going to open up the files. There's various sites that you could download these things from. I can put some links in the description of the main sites that I use to get them, but you're going to hit apply all on the first and then pretty much yes to all. Just leave kind of the settings alone. I've never really had to mess with those too much. Most files open fine, so I just jump forward here. So what we're going to do is select all of the tiles and we're going to converge them into one single tile. I want to hit no here for the scalar fields, and after a second or so it's going to make it into a single tile. And then the next step we're going to do is change the active scalar field to intensity. So this will kind of show us the track and how we can see everything because of the way the light comes back to the laser. It will change the color. So we're going to go to the global shift here and set everything to 0. It mainly is to kind of set the 0 point closer. So if you leave that alone and bring it into Blender, the thing's going to be often way off in the middle of nowhere. So what we're doing here is just kind of make it so the model is centered at the 0 point inside the 3D program. So we use the point picker and we kind of just grab these values. I just throw them off to the side so I can view them. And then we're going to go up to Tools or Edit and Apply Transform. And then we'll go to Axis and Angle. We're going to make sure we do Apply Inverse Transformation at the bottom here. Make sure that it has a check mark in there. And then we want to enter those same values that we saw in the point picker. And what this will do is just say we'll take the we'll center it on whatever point you picked. Doesn't have to be super accurate. We're only using the whole numbers here. We don't really care about the decimals. It's not that critical. The main reason for it is when we do all this is as if we segment these pieces, as we're going to do next, we're going to segment them out. So if you have to import export models in the future with Cloud Compare, everything will line up. You don't have to worry about moving things around. You can just import it into your 3D program, and it'll be in the right place every time. So it's just nice to take that extra step now, so you don't have to worry about it later. So first, I'll show you the polygon select. You would use this for mainly for road courses where you can kind of really pick out the track. You don't want to have too much extra of the data in your program because the more you have, obviously, the slower it gets, especially depending on how dense your data is. So we want to this is a simple setup here with this track. So we're just going to do the rectangle select, and then we do segment in, and uh, after a second or so, it'll will show you what's going on with the segmentation, and then the green check mark will finalize it. So you'll see it will happen on the left. It'll break it into two separate pieces, and you can turn off and on each selection and all we really care about is this, for now anyway, for the initial track, we only care about the main thing. So you can look around it, see what it looks like, uh, and see what we're dealing with. So first step normally is to just convert it a mesh. It makes a duplicate of it. It doesn't do any real conversion. Most processes in Cloud Compare, everything you do kind of makes a second copy of everything because there's no real undo feature in Cloud Compare. So this isn't a mesh. You're going to run a lot slower now, but you can see that it's a 3D mesh of the point cloud. And the next step we're going to do is we're going to convert the scalar fields uh, from the scale fields and put it into the RGB values, basically the vertex colors of the model. So you just convert to RGB. I use no here, just it seems to work better. And so what that does is that bakes the scalar fields into the vertex of the model. So now what we want to do is we want to export to, or save as, is basically an export as a FBX mesh. You can also use an STL file, but you will not be able to keep the vertex colors with the STL file. So using the FBX, and you want to use FBX binary on the far left there. And this is, of course, on as of this time, the later version 2.11 of Cloud Compare. It's changed over the years a little bit here and there, but so newer versions could change even further. So that's FBX is exported. We're done with that. So now we're just going to export the raw cloud itself to it with the PLY format. It's kind of the format that Blender likes to use by default. It's not going to have any coloring. It's not going to have any intensity data. You choose binary there, but at least it's nice to have, and we'll show you later how having the raw point cloud is sometimes beneficial over having the mesh of the point cloud. So now the last step I like to do is to render to file. I kind of zoom in on it here a couple times. You can play with it, see what works best for you. It's going to make a screenshot of this whole kind of viewport. So then you just take that image into an editor program like GIMP or Photoshop, and you just crop out the surroundings so you get just the tile. And you'll see it later. I have a sample image that will be just that. And that's pretty much it for Cloud Compare. There are other things you can do to clean things up inside Cloud Compare, but I usually like to do it all in a 3D program. But yeah, you can play with it, do what you want in Cloud Compare, but that's for the basic steps of preparing the file and preparing it into bring it into a 3D program. So next we're actually going to jump into 2.8, and we'll take a look at what we have to do to deal with that FBX file because there is a bug in 2.79. So here we are in 2.8. Obviously, it's still a free program. So, and obviously, if you're just getting into Blender now, you're gonna be into it, and you're gonna be using this anyway. So, obviously, this is where you're gonna go. You're not gonna go back to 2.79 after this, but there's a bug with 2.79 importing some FBX files, especially from Cloud Compare, that screws up the scale. And what But 2.8 doesn't seem to have this bug. So these are the settings you need. You need Y forward and Z up. The rest of the settings don't seem to matter, but make sure manual orientation is selected, and then you select the file and you import it, and you'll get this. So then we'll take, we'll save as, and we'll save as a regular blend file. I saved it as that test blend file, and so that's pretty much it for 2.8. So now we'll go back into 2.7, and we're going to append the 2.8 file. It's already open here, but I'm just going to back out so you can see. So it's that test blend. You go in, object. There's some compatibility issues going back to 2.79, but just importing an object isn't a problem at all. So it'll take a second here, and then it'll show up, and it'll have the correct scale. You don't have to worry about it. It will match up to the point cloud, which has also been imported already. You just go to File, Import, PLY format. It's pretty straightforward. I may even go over it again later. I'm not sure in one of the next sections, but you can see everything matches perfectly between the point cloud and the mesh. There's no scale issues, so it's just a little cheap step you got to do to kind of overcome a little bug that I found with FBX Import. If you use an STL file and don't care about Vertex Colors, um, you stick with the STL format, then you have no scaling issues whatsoever inside Blender. So here we are with the mesh inside 2.79, and what I like to do now is I like to create a 2D plane with that intensity data image that we made earlier. And initially, I just use the dimensions. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the dimensions, I just enter the pixels size of the image, and it just makes it so it's the correct aspect ratio. You don't have to worry about real anything else other than the scale at this point. The rotation and everything else should be perfect, so you just gotta worry about the scale. So you go to edit mode, you open up the intensity JPEG, and it will become an option. And you can see that's the vertex colors below on the data. It's not a texture, it's the vertex colors baked into the data. We're going to turn that off here, just to kind of speed up the viewport because it can be a little slow when you're displaying all that all on there. So we'll just put that onto solid view. And what I like to do is line up uh, any particular object. Obviously, they're literally from the same source, so it's pretty simple to line up. You just pick one building, and then you kind of pick the 3D point there and make sure it pivots or scales on that 3D cursor, and you just scale and just fine tune it, play with it, get it so it fits just right. You want it to be as close as possible. You're going to be placing objects with this mainly. You can also bring in a Google image too. It's not going to line up perfectly the track, but it's good for like placing objects and walls, and sometimes it's easier to see with the actual Google image rather than sometimes looking at this basically grayscale intensity data. But you see, I kind of scroll up and down into the data so you can kind of see, make sure everything lines up. And now I enabled the vertex colors again on the data, and everything should really kind of line up perfectly. It doesn't have to be too perfect, but the better you get it, you'll be better off. So you'll see what I usually like to do now is when you start making your initial splines, you just kind of base it off of the 2D image only, just because the speed of the viewport is so much faster. And then once we get the basic X and the Y sorted out, then we'll worry about the Z and shrink it down to the data. But so now we're just going to work off of this, and we'll create a curve and scale it up, and then just go through the process of bringing it around the track. And all we're concerned about right now is the driving surface, so it's pretty much white line to the wall is all we're going to care about. And so yeah, you just do the basic process. It's just a quick run down of how to do it. Obviously, you go all the way around and then connect it, and so then that's what you do. In the next few sessions, we'll go over a already finished curve and how to worry about shrinking it to data. So we're looking back at the mesh again. It's just a quick overview of the vertex colors again. So as I said, you can use the STL format out of Cloud Compare, and it won't have any scaling issues, and it will look at just like this. But the main thing, it just won't have the coloring, the vertex colors, which is the intensity data. So um, you don't necessarily need that. It is handy to have, um, but if you didn't care about that, you can go right to STL and then you can use that the 2D plane the way we made that before and use that to line up all your objects and everything. But there's basically this is foolproof. It is what it is. The intensity is going to match the data perfectly, and you won't have to worry about lining anything up. Um, so that was just showing that. And then I also have the raw point cloud in here, which is handy to have. It's a little faster on the viewport, and we're going to use it to shrink our um, curves down on this part of the data because it's a little better than using the mesh. And we'll show you why in a little bit. But but yeah, so it's good to always bring the curve in and say that's in PLY format, and there's no scaling issues that I've ever had with that. So the next step here is we're going to clean this up, and you can see a little bit of wave noises inside the data, and that's basically from the aerial scan. You know, they're taken from thousands of feet up, so there's going to have some aerial vertical inaccuracies. And ground data gets a similar thing, but we're going to use the corrective smooth modifier. You check when you check only smooth and pin boundaries. Pin boundaries is not super important for this, but when you're doing other stuff, sometimes it's handy. It's just a habit to use. You can see it smooths out the mesh quite a bit. It does a pretty good job of taking out that micro noise that we want to get rid of because it's not really the track's micro noise. Plus, this track is in rough shape anyway, so we want to reproduce it as if it's an actual track in the 90s and not what it is now. So we want to clean it up. Well, all we're after is the elevations and cambers for the most part. We're not too concerned about all that micro noise because we're going to add noise in later when we do our physical meshes. Um, so we're here. I like to go then in sculpt mode and then apply the corrective smooth modifier. And in sculpt mode, we got to make sure a couple things. I like to use the scrape tool for one. It seems to work best for this. And then we want to make sure to go to the symmetry lock down here and turn off this mirror X. It's on by default in these older versions. I don't know about the newer ones. And then you want to lock X and Y so it won't move left and right. It'll just move up and down. But if you don't get rid of that mirror X thing, everything you do here on this side will be doing the same thing on the left or on the right of the X axis, and you'll have holes in the track from where you're it's kind of a weird thing. But anyway, I'm sure it's meant for when you're sculpting things like faces and stuff. But for this, you want to make sure that's off. So you do your best to kind of smooth this out as best you can. It's also important to note that a good practice is to duplicate everything. And I like to, before you do any big changes again, and what I like to do is the original point cloud or mesh before I did any of this smoothing and was to export it to its own blend file. So all that, the point cloud, um, and even this, after I'm done cleaning this up, I'll export this to its own blend file because you're not going to want to hold this data in your file all the way to the end of time. It's going to slow down your file and make it huge, and there's really no need to have it in there all the time once you kind of get your track shrunk down to it. And don't worry about the walls here; it's not a big deal. We're not too worried about that. As I say, we keep the original data around, so if we need to recall it, we can always append it back into the scene and go from there. So it's just a good practice to have. It's always good to have a backup plan when you're doing this stuff. A lot of this stuff is a one-way street, and if you mess something up, you're kind of SOL. So you want to make sure you always have a way to go back if possible. So here you'll see, even though we smoothed it out, the vertex colors are still going to show like the spikes are still there. It's not a big deal. It's just the way it is, and we can. It's just a visual thing. It's not actually there, so I wouldn't worry about it. You can turn off the vertex colors and look at it if you want, but you can't turn them off unless you have more than one set in there, which I forgot about. So I'm like waiting for it to do anything here, but it's not, and it's not gonna. But anyway, don't worry about the little dots in the track anymore. It's not gonna cause a problem. So we're going to move on to the curves after this, and the curves are already made. They're basically from white line to the wall. Um, and unfortunately, the way Blender works, there's no like simple way to make a mesh between those two curves. So it's not a bad process, but it's not like an automatic process. But I want to show you here how the curves you want when you shrink them to the data you want to make sure they're below the data. If you bring them up and they're above the data and you try to shrink it down, they're going to get caught on the wall or any kind of object that's above the track, and it's going to cause a problem. But if you bring it down below the surface, you can see it kind of locks in there, and the closest point that it's going to lock to is going to be the track itself. And also make sure a key point here is um, this is just showing that it's all kind of messed up when it's above, but make sure the nearest vertex is chosen on the shrink wrap modifier, because obviously by default it's surface point, and there's no surface points when it's only a bunch of vertices. So that was just a quick note about that as far as when you're going up to the track edge. If you got a wall near the track edge, that's something you have to worry about. Not a big deal if it's not a if it's just an open track, but for something with a wall, it's a key thing to note. Um, so then I just make a duplicate of the splines, and we're going to be joining them together, and then we're going to apply the shrink wrap. And then we're going to convert them to a mesh. And then depending on how um, close your control points were on the spline, the vertex is going to be way too close. We don't really need it that dense. At least not at this point. The whole key thing here is to make a smooth track. So I like to just remove doubles to kind of merge things together and clean things up. It's not going to be perfect. We're not looking for perfection, but we just don't want it to. We don't need crazy high resolution stuff right now because we're going to be smoothing later uh, and make things a little cleaner. So I just do a quick fill here. I usually do just two pieces by hand, and then select all the rest, and do it Alt F, which will do a beauty fill. And you can see it automatically kind of fills in the mesh from each side. Then do an Alt J, which will kind of semi bring it back to a quad mesh. Not perfect, it's no way. They're not identical matches as far as vertex count, but as long as it's close enough. So now we're just gonna do is we're gonna make a new center line. I used to build from a center line, but I found this process to be a little better, where you select each edge and invert your selection, do a subdivision of what you got, and that gives you a nice center line of the center of the track. It's not 100% perfect, but it's pretty good. Um, and so now you have all your track widths and everything are perfect, and you do have a center line of everything. So that's where we're going to use that later. So I just separate that out and to its own object and move it off to another layer. We'll be using that in a little bit here. Um, but just to show how it doesn't quite line up with the data. It's only lined up at the edges and the center of the track, where if there's a belly in the track or whatever, or it's just not going to line up because it's only the inner and outer edges. And back in the old days of track building, I'm sure that was fine, but that's not good enough today. We want to have every little detail as much as we can, or as much as the data will allow. So what we do here is we select the long edges and do an invert again, and then we're going to subdivide once. So this gives us some points in the middle. So now we want to use vertex groups because we want to leave the edges alone because they're perfectly matched to the data via the curves that they came from. But the center section is not. So, but we want to shrink that to the data. But you'll see here that we're just going to create a vertex group and we're going to assign those vertices to it. And I always like to verify its selection just by clicking select. Yep, it's just the center sections, so that's fine. So then we're going to go back to shrink wrap modifier, and we're going to shrink it to the mesh data that's now smoothed, or smoother. You see it doesn't quite line up very well, and but we're going to pick the mesh as our object to shrink to, and you're going to see it's going to instantly kind of shrink everything, but then the edges are going to get all kind of funky. And that's what we want to avoid. That's why we did the vertex groups. So that's trying to shrink to the walls and all kinds of stuff at the edges on the outside of the track, and we don't want that. So we're going to go here over to the vertex group, and we're going to select that group we made, and it's only going to care about the center pieces. It's not going to care about the edges. So the edges will be left alone as they were before, and the center will be nice and shrunk down to the thing, and you can see to the mesh, and you can see now it matches much better all the way around the track. You can see on and off the difference between the center and the how it was with just the edges lined up. So that's pretty much as good as we're going to get. You see it's pretty smooth. It's not on smooth mode or smooth shading right now, so we're gonna switch it to smooth shading, and you'll see it's pretty smooth. I'm sure you could probably drive on that and it'd probably be pretty good, but we're gonna go one step further. We're gonna apply the shrink wrap modifier, and we're gonna then do a subdivision on it. And as long as the piece is all one piece, you do a subdivision on it. It shouldn't change the outer geometry at all, but it'll subdivide the inner part of the mesh and make it nice and smooth. So now if we drove on this, it would be like driving on glass, but we'll have all the bigger undulations, as the elevations change along the down the front straightaway, and have all the correct cambers of the corner, exactly as it really is. So that's the kind of the key. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the um, center section that we made, the center line that we made, and we're going to convert that to a curve. Although I think I mess up here and I didn't hit the right thing. So we're gonna go back, yeah, mesh from curve, curve from mesh, yeah. So so now it'll be into a mesh, and then I like to change it to in edit mode. You just select all and then change the spline type to Bezier. So now it's a Bezier curve, or Bezier. I don't know how to say it. Never knew how to say it. And so now we can make a plane, or I like to make the cursor go to the active, so that way when we make this plane, it'll be at the correct origin of the curve. It'll line up perfectly with the curve. If you don't do that, you gotta make sure you match the position of the object to the curve. So I always like to do that so it joins it right to the center, the origin of the curve. So you add an array modifier and then a curve modifier and assign the curve, which is just basic stuff. And then I like to scale it on the x-axis, which will shrink it down. And I kind of do this by eye. The key thing here is that your turns are smooth. You don't want a bunch of straight lines that you can pick out like the old R Factor days or GPL days where every turn was just like a notchy straight line. You want to try to be the straight lines are close enough together where it actually looks like a curve. So, and with the oval, I can kind of go nuts because uh, it's not that big of a track and really not that much going to be around it. So make it pretty dense, and then you add enough of the array to bring it back around the other side. And so that's our basic thing. It's going to follow the elevations, but it's not going to follow the cambers. You'll see it here. It's flat. Yeah, it's just a flat track, but it has the basic shape of the track and the elevations from one end to the other. The next step is we're going to shrink it to the mesh we made before. And I'm just going to apply a modifier material here just to change the color so it's not so it's a little easier to see. And one of the key things I like here is I like to make the, the new model a little bit wider than the mesh that we're what we want to shrink to. And you'll see why in a second. What it'll do is it'll shrink it. It'll bring the edges in and match the host model perfectly. And yeah, so we want to add a shrink wrap, and then we're gonna hit the data or the mesh we made from the data, and you can see it matches perfectly now. It took all those points that were outside and brought them in, so now it's a perfect match. You don't want to be too wide, but just wide enough to cover every point of it. So obviously, just like before, just the edges now. So now we're going to take the center and subdivide a bunch of times, and that will be our cross section, and that will match our made mesh near perfectly. And so that'll be our perfect quad mesh that we can easily UV map, and that'll be our visual mesh from here going forward. And we'll make a physical mesh from that later, and make it high resolution, add bumps to it, and then shrink the visual down to that. So it's a whole process. But this is mainly just to cover how to get from data to a quad mesh that we can use going forward. This is just a quick thing I wanted to show, mainly for road courses. It's not going to be really needed for this oval, small little oval, but for road courses, you'll notice if you ever look at many of my tracks on wireframe that I like to have the corners a higher resolution than the straightaways, just to save a few triangles here and there. Um, there's not a whole lot of need for a high to keep. Some people keep the same resolution all the way around the track, like I showed before. Um, but for some reason, when I first started, I just decided it was a good idea to do it this way. It's pretty much the same process. We're going to apply this modifier. We're going to merge vertices, and you're going to see how the it's pretty low resolution. I kept it low resolution on purpose. So what we're going to do, since it's still attached to the spline, if we go around here and select just the edges of each end of the track, and then do a subdivision, um, it will be nice and smooth. It will continue to follow the curve as closely as possible. You can see now it's nice and smooth, and you can increase the amount of subdivision. So then you have your turns are a little bit higher resolution than this is a little exaggerated just for show, but you can see how the process of how to make the turns just a little bit higher resolution. It's a little bit of a manual process to go to each set of turns and make it, whatever. But if you have a really tight turn on the track, you're going to want to crank up the resolution on that turn just to make sure it's smooth. As obviously, if the turn is a more open turn, you don't have to worry about it too much. But if you get a nice hairpin or something, you're going to want that to be pretty high resolution, and maybe not the rest of the track needs to be that. So you kind of can save a little bit on your triangle count in the long run when you do this. One last thing I wanted to mention with Cloud Compare is just when you do everything, set everything as you want, do all your, apply all your transforms and everything and get everything how you want it. You want to select everything and save it as a bin format. It's a Cloud Compare format. And you just want to save it. That way you can always open it again. All that stuff's applied. You don't have to redo it anymore. You can always export it out again, or if you want to go back later and grab that external land that we segmented out and export that into your 3D program, you can. It's just something you're going to want to do to kind of save your life when you want to go back to the data and don't have to worry about redoing all that stuff. So that's pretty much it for this one. As I say, the main process was to go from Cloud Compare with the LiDAR format with LAS format into multiple file formats as far as a mesh and the point cloud, and to get it to a quad mesh and something we can work with further as far as easy UV maps with following active quads and stuff. And we'll be covering that and hopefully further segments of this. And to the ultimate goal would be to pretty much document just about every aspect of building this little track and bringing it back to life. So hopefully stay tuned, and hopefully I'll be able to complete this. It is a little time consuming, and I'm learning with this whole video thing and figuring it all out as I go. But hopefully this makes some sense to some people, and we can continue on and help people out and make it more accurate tracks.